Hi there and welcome to this special 4-part series, Managing ESG Risk, produced by Art of Procurement in partnership with Dun Bradstreet. I'm Philip Ideson, the host of Art of Procurement. I'm joined over the course of this series by Brian Alster, the General Manager of Finance and Risk Solutions, and Rochelle March, the Head of ESG Product, both at Dun Bradstreet. We'll dig into the emerging imperative for procurement to understand the ESG profiles of their suppliers and provide actionable tips and recommendations on how to manage ESG in the context of broader supplier and supply chain risk management. In part 1 of this series, I'm joined by Rochelle March to broadly discuss ESG and the metrics and data that procurement teams can use to assess suppliers in the context of their ESG objectives. And I started by asking Rochelle if she could share more about her role at Dun Bradstreet.
My job is to help develop data sets, analytics, user interfaces, and tools where customers can access ESG data and use it to inform their activities and decisions.
So just to set the scene, ESG is one of those terms that for a lot of folks, they may be relatively new. The last year or so may start to be hearing about it, but a lot of people aren't necessarily sure what ESG is. So I just wonder if you could provide a little bit of context about what we mean when we say ESG.
Definitely. So ESG, it stands for Environmental Social Governance. And it's emerged in the last decade or so around distinct metrics that are trying to capture company activities around environmental, social, or governance topics. Mm-hmm. For example, under environment, you will see a capturing of metrics around greenhouse gas emissions as it relates to pollution from emissions, as well as contribution to climate change, and so on. Could be also as simple as their energy management, water management. Essentially, how is a company managing their natural resources? Under social, you can see metrics related to labor relations, supplier engagement, workforce, such as diversity, things that are much more socially oriented, maybe education and training, retention, to get a sense of how a company may be managing those resources. And then finally, in governance, we talk about accountability, transparency. This is where somewhat more traditional business metrics may be found around corruption, bribery, and so on, but are also deemed to be really important beyond just the financial factors.
Right. And how did you get involved in the ESG space?
Yeah, so I've been working in this space for almost a decade. So kind of from the beginning, definitely seen it evolve. I started working in sustainability after going to grad school for a Master's of Science and an MBA. And I've always been very attracted to environmental issues and the natural environment. But I did feel like I needed financial literacy for my arguments to really have weight and for people to be able to translate my passion for the environment to something that's more easily understood, which is commerce and financials. And I first, out of grad school, worked in consulting. So I worked with many different companies around their sustainability strategy, their goals and targets, benchmarking. And during that time, I really saw the transition from a more conceptual framework around sustainability. You should do this and triple bottom line and so on into more data-driven aspects. For example, a lot of tech companies wanted to know why some concepts were important and why they should do that. And while I was there, I saw kind of the growth of ESG in the financial markets. So the integration of ESG factors into investment decisions. Yeah. And that was really, I saw the growth of green bonds really take off. And to me, it was super interesting to apply this kind of technical, quantitative route to these broad, sometimes values-based topics. So I entered the financial space, and then part of the big element of ESG is making it usable, making it actionable, not just providing the information. And that's where a product lens comes into play, and what I'm doing currently at D&B.
It's a really fascinating space, and one I'm sure that you're seeing so much more interest in now, even than 12, 24 months ago. It's certainly something from a procurement perspective, for sure. It's certainly something that we see. I wonder if, you talked about, seeing metrics from an investment community perspective. You talked about green bonds a little bit. How are we getting a bit more granular in terms of how we can then apply some of these metrics that you've talked about at an individual supplier level, so they can actually help us make individual supplier-based decisions?
Definitely. So these metrics, like I mentioned, have come from a conceptual, we should think about these elements, to what's the data? What does the data look like? Yeah. How can I compare it to peers, to the industry average, and so on? So a very standard metric today is scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions. These relate to either the direct emissions from a company's factories or cars, scope 1, or any emissions related to electricity use, scope 2. So you see companies trying to lower their scope 3, which is often supplier impact, by understanding, how much are we spending with suppliers, and how greenhouse gas emission intensive are there suppliers that are more efficient with their energy and resources, and have less greenhouse gas emissions. So you see that. You also see very common around diverse procurements, particularly in Europe and the US. How can I increase the spend on minority-owned businesses in my supply chain, for example? So that's a very easy metric, either yes or no, and but it does, require the data collection of that. And then I think a third piece that's really risen too is kind of more around that compliance piece, but also social, around human rights risk. So there was a very seminal case in Bangladesh where Rana Plaza was a subcontractor of many major fashion brands. And the factory collapsed because of inadequate structure issues and working conditions, and killed 1,000 people.
Yeah.
So no one wants to be contributing to that, both from kind of an ethical lens, but also a reputational component.
So as you think about collecting data, as you think about it from a product perspective, to make that available to procurement teams to be able to make decisions based on, what are the kind of data sources, or I'm thinking what is it that you're able to collect that helps somebody then go and say, okay, I know that my scope 1 is here and my scope 2 is there, or of a provider, for example? Is it kind of self-reported? Are you gathering data sets from and then bringing them all together and collating them? I'd love to know just a little bit more about the data that's then helping you make those decisions.
Definitely. So traditionally, the main data sources were self-reported disclosure, such as in sustainability reports, or voluntarily provided to, say, CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project for emissions, for example, or collected individually through surveys. For example, if a company was really interested, for example, Walmart, I think 2008 or even prior, would send out a sustainability questionnaire to any potential suppliers, and they'd have to fill that out. So previously, it's really been self-reported information. And at Dun Bradstreet, we definitely take that in through surveys and through reports, but we have a lot of other information we collect too. So D&B has a very large global data cloud where we have business information on over 400 million active entities. And this includes account receivables information, what people are spending on, who they're spending it with. And you can get a sense of their priorities. How much did they spend on employee training, on industrial safety equipment, philanthropy, so on. We also keep track of any derogatory information, lawsuits, inquiries by government or tax auditors, any type of also business indicators that may be risky. Is it meeting with creditors? Might the company be going out of business or be dealing with issues? So that's definitely a huge source of S and G and a little bit of E, mostly around compliance. But then we complement that also through news, certification data, such as ISO or any type of green certification like LEED or FSC for paper. We are always scraping the web for any NGO data sets, NGO reports, any type of government reports, always with permission, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And are always on the lookout. And then we also acquire data. So
Right.
we're really trying to bring in lots of different sources to create a more holistic picture, inside out and outside in, of what's happening to millions of companies.
Right. It's fascinating actually being able to see the spending priorities, as there's no more driver of importance to an organization than where they spend their money. And being able to access the data in a way that gives you that big picture perspective, like you said, rather than just taking the supplier's word for it in how they're self-reporting. To start to wrap up this conversation, it's a conversation I think that we could probably talk for a lot longer on and dig a lot deeper into. But I'm thinking about those procurement teams who they know that this is something that they want to do, and perhaps that's because they're wanting to look at another value lever that procurement can pull, or it may be that ESG reporting is coming top down and there's been a requirement now for procurement to really get more involved and understand it a little bit more. For teams that are just starting to incorporate ESG and ESG reporting into their supply discovery process, into supplier pre-qualification, for example, what kind of recommendations do you have for where they should start?
Sure. So I think there's two routes. One is kind of sourcing that data externally, and the other is collecting it yourself. So on the one hand, you could work with a provider like DNB and other providers that are out there to instantly try to get a directional score on your suppliers.
Mm-hmm.
And that way you can hotspot higher risk ones and also evaluate candidates for onboarding. If you're just getting started and maybe aren't ready to invest in that type of solution, it's important to prioritize what type of information you really want to know about suppliers. Is it their carbon footprint? Is it their policies on labor? Is it their diversity? And ask them that through the onboarding contracts or as part of a requirement in RFPs.
Right.
And then, throughout the year, as you interact with your suppliers and request, update contracts and so on, creating opportunities to collect that type of information. And many suppliers may already have something. So it's definitely increasing in popularity. But many too, it's going to be their first time. And so just being really clear on the type of information you want. And I would recommend, just from a data perspective, trying to get something that can be standardized, like a number or a binary type of request, rather than an explanation and so on, because that's just, analytically hard to do at scale.
You can do apples to apples comparisons then and start baselining and benchmarking performance against it.
Exactly.
And one last question, as you think about, okay, now we've got this data and we've got this insight, the kind of final piece of the puzzle is, okay, what do I do about it? Do you find that procurement teams have the ability to go and influence their suppliers' choices, on a individual supplier basis, or is the fact that it's being reported and it's being reviewed enough of its own to help drive decisions at their potential suppliers, if you know what I mean? Like, is it a direct influence between procurement and a potential partner, or is there a little bit more kind of at stake here before an organization might make changes in ultimately what those scores become?
Sure. I think it's a little bit of both. I've personally worked with companies who were inspired to, initiate sustainability activities because they wanted to be applicable for RFPs to huge customers they had. And so they were incentivized to do so. And then on the flip side, I've seen other companies have requests for data and, say, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. And then they see it more and more. And then they see it as a competitive advantage. If I'm able to submit information around these ideas, I'm going to stand out compared to my competitors. And then, of course, you see suppliers who, it's one other thing to do, right? And,
Right.
it's want to ignore it. But I think ESG is definitely on the road to be more and more mainstream and incorporated. So I would recommend the earlier to get a handle on those pieces, probably the better.
Thanks for listening to Managing Supplier ESG Risk, a special series from Art of Procurement and Dun Bradstreet. To listen to all 4 episodes in this series, go to artofprocurement.com/ESG risk. That's artofprocurement.com/ESG risk.